Welcome to the Grainline nest. In this video, I'm going to show you how to take a beautiful quilt and upcycle it into this gorgeous quilt jacket. It all started with a trip to Hobby Lobby. Yes, that's right. I found myself in the bedding at Hobby Lobby, but I just couldn't bring myself to spending $80 on a quilt, especially one that I wanted to cut up. However, they have their half off sales, and this was half off. So I got this quilt for $40. It's a king size, and I'm going to make more than one coat. But right now I'm going to show you one of the coats that I made. While I was purchasing the blanket, I knew back home I had this beautiful complementary fabric left over from another quilt that I did. And I also knew I had this wonderful Tamarack jacket pattern at home that I just needed to alter for a friend. I cut my back piece, 2 side pieces, 2 sleeves, and a collar. Before I start sewing my pattern pieces together, I like to take each one and serge around all of the edges. This way I stop fraying before it gets to be out of hand, and it also gives it a nice professional finish when you sew your seams together, just like this. If you don't have a serger, you can always zigzag your edges. The next step is to cut your flower petals out of your scrap fabric. I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have 8 petals times 2 because I doubled them. And I had 4 different fabrics. So I cut out a total of 4 pieces of each color and then doubled them up around the flower. I centered them on the back of the jacket, and then I pinned them into place before I sewed them. My goal with this design is to get a ragged edge look. So I use my 1/4 inch foot, I back stitch, and then I sew a 1/4 inch around each flower petal. And by doing this, it leaves the edges loose so that it can fray when you wash it. That's the whole goal, is to have a ragged edge. And this is what it looks like before you add your center circle of fabric to finish your flower. Now it's time to fray our edges. So you take a sharp pair of scissors and then you just snip up to your stitch line along each petal. And this takes a little bit of time, but the look, once it's done, is fabulous, even with 2 layers of fabric. It will fray up nicely. In the beginning, you just ruffle it up with your fingers. And then as you wear it, it will also fray a little bit more. But once you put it in the washer that first time and dry it, man, does the design come alive. It is gorgeous. Now do the same thing to a sleeve and to the front of your jacket. And of course, this is your design, so you can place it anywhere you wish, but this is what I did. The next step is to match our shoulder seams. So with your back side facing up and your front pieces facing down, so right sides are together, we're going to match up the shoulder seams, and then we're going to stitch them a 1/2 inch at the shoulders using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I used a stitch length of a 2.5, and I put just a regular presser foot on there, but I also have a magnetic guide that I use for a 1/2 inch. See the magnetic guide there I'm following along with my presser foot? And then I back stitch at the end. Next, I press my seams open. Then I lay it on my table face up, and I get my collar piece ready. Now I find the center of my back around the collar top and the center of my collar, and I match those two up with the pins right there, and I pin it in place. Now my collar is the same on both sides, so it really doesn't matter, but if you have material that has a right side and a wrong side, you're going to make sure that your right side of your collar is facing up and your wrong side of your collar is towards the back of your backing there, your back fabric. I hope I'm making sense. Your wrong side is facing down and your right side is facing up is what I'm trying to say. And then you pin it into place, and it should match up to the edge of your jacket. Your collar should reach clear to the edge. Your collar should look like this when it's pinned into place. Now take your collar over to the sewing machine. We're going to sew it into place. And I just used 1/4 of an inch and stitched it into place. You're not going to see this stitch. This will be hidden eventually. And you can just baste it on if you wish. But I just used 1/4 inch seam allowance and I stitched it right into place clear across the collar top there. And I kept readjusting to make sure that the bottom of the fabric of the jacket matched and aligned with the collar itself. That's very important. You don't want to have any ridges or puckers, so keep maneuvering and massaging your fabric so that each back and collar line up. The next step is to add bias tape to the edge of your collar. This is 1.5 inch wide bias tape. I do have a separate video on how to make the bias tape, so take a look at that video if you want to now, or just come back to it at the end of the video. But here it's 1.5 inches wide, and I have it pinned all along the collar edge. The wrong side of the bias tape is facing up, and notice it's pinned on the jacket side, not the collar side. Next, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, sew it into place. Now we want to iron this seam down. So using a ham, it gives you that rounded contouring base that you need. You want to iron that seam towards the collar. If you don't have a ham, you can certainly give it a good press on a flat surface. It's just easier with a rounded surface. Now we want to form our collar stand. So what you do is you take your bias tape and you fold it around the raw edge of the jacket and pin it into place like this. You work from the center out to each side, and it will look like this at the end. Now it's time to top stitch it in place. I used a stitch length of a 3, and my needle's in the center position of the placement. However, the needle is on the very edge of the fabric there. So I got as close to the edge that I could, and I stitched pretty slow so that I could have a nice looking stitch line there, because you will see this as you put your jacket on and off. You will see this stitching here, so you want it to look very professional and nice and straight. This is what it looks like when it's stitched into place. Then I put it on my mannequin and I admired my work for a little bit. Such satisfaction. Now it's time to add the binding to the rest of our jacket. On each side of our jacket pattern pieces, there were markings to indicate where the binding actually starts. So I marked those with a pen, straight pins, on my fabric as you see here. Now this binding is 2 inches wide, And I start at the pen mark there, and I am sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around the edge of my binding. And I just take my time. I back stitch, and then slowly move all the way around. Before I reach the first corner, I take a ruler here and I measure a 1/2 inch and I mark it with a pen, a straight pen. I ensure that my 1/2 inch marking is accurate. And then I sew down the rest of the side clear up to that straight pen. And notice I have to move my magnetic marker out of the way because I didn't want to take my pen out because I want to make sure I get that accurate. Then I turn my fabric and I sew to the corner. And this is what it looks like, straight down and off to the corner. Then I lay my material on a flat surface and I fold my binding to the right and I put a pin in it to hold it in place. Then I fold my binding over to the left, or in this picture here, folded it down, and I pin it again into place. And then I sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance on that side. You do the same process on all of your corners, even on your collar corners. Same process. So once you have your binding sewn on, it's time to iron it down so you can get a nice crisp line there. So I just take my iron all the way around and open it up like this so that I have a nice pressed line. In full transparency here, I usually try to glue baste my binding down so I don't have to use pins. But I did a practice run and it did not work on this particular quilt fabric. My quilt soaked up the glue as almost like it was a towel, so that was no good. So I reverted back to my sewing skills that I've learned for a very long time, and I wrapped the binding around and I pinned it into place. At the corners, in order to get that perfect mitered edge, I iron out like this and then I fold it over, and see that beautiful miter that forms? I iron it into place and then I pin it into place. Ensuring that I'm catching the other side with the straight pin as well, because if I'm not, I have to repin it. As I stitch along the pin line there, I want to ensure that I'm catching the backing as well. Next, I change my presser foot to where it has the guide right down the center of my foot. And I put that on my machine. And I make sure that I adjust my stitch length to a 3. And my needle is in a 6 position, which means it's over to the right side pretty much as far as it can go. And then I just slowly stitch along the edge of my binding there, using that center guide right up against my fabric, but my needle is still pushed over to the left as far as it can go. And you can see in this video I have a very bad habit of putting pins in my mouth. I was hoping that didn't show up in the video, but it did. And it's one of the biggest faults that I have. Don't judge me. Old habits are hard to break. And this is what your finished bias taped edge will look like. And look at that beautiful corner. I couldn't wait to get it on my mannequin and admire the work again. Putting on binding's not easy, but boy, when you do it and you get it right, it is so satisfying. Now we're ready for our sleeves. What you want to do is make sure that you lay your jacket out like this, face up, and then find the center of your sleeve. Notice you have a back side of your sleeve that was double notched, and a front side of your sleeve that was single notched. You want to make sure you're lining up with right sides together your sleeves. So here I'm finding the center of my sleeve, and I make sure that my pen is in the exact center. Then with right sides together, I lay it on top of my jacket just like this, and I pin that center mark of my sleeve to the shoulder seam. So after I match up the center, I then move on to the side. I clip and pin the one side of my sleeve and then the other side of my sleeve. Then I ease the rest of the fabric in between those pins by pinning along that seam line there. Want to make sure that I get them nice and even, no puckers, and no wavy material left over, just nice and even. Because if you don't, then your jacket's not going to lay even when you go to sew it on the machine. Back at the sewing machine, I have a stitch length of a 2.5, and I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm sewing along the armhole there. Before I ironed my seam open, I did take an additional step, and I went ahead and serged those two seams together. They were previously serged as separate pieces, but I felt that it laid, at least with this fabric, it laid nicer with the two seams together as one serged area. And here, once again, I'm using the ham underneath, since this is a rounded area, to go ahead and iron it down flat. The ironing gives it a nice professional look on the other side. Now it's time to sew our side seams, but first, before we pin the side seams together, make sure that your binding is on the bottom of your sleeves, because you can do it last. You can bind the bottom of your sleeves last if you wish, but it's easier to do it this way. Either way, you'll be successful, but if you're a beginner sewer, I encourage you to put your binding on first. So back at the sewing machine, I am sewing with a 2.5 stitch length and a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I start at my sleeves, and then I work my way down to the bottom of the jacket. So you just sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way down. Notice I switched over to clips instead of pins. I'm trying to be a better role model for you and not put pins in my mouth. And clips are too big for my mouth, so I have to put them someplace else. I hope I made you laugh. As I work my way down to the bottom of the jacket, you'll notice that I just sew straight off. So I'm coming up to the end and just taking my time. And then I'm just going to go straight down. I'm not going to go around that curve. In fact, I'm showing you here what I'm doing, just straight down the side. When I get down to that bottom point, I make sure I go back and forth. I do a reverse stitch several times to hold it nice and tight. And here's the finished jacket. Like I said, as you wash it, this design's going to get prettier and prettier over time. Please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video.